Namibia is pretty interesting. It's a country that's super dry down in the southwest of Africa. But despite its dryness, the borders of Namibia are to some extent outlined by rivers. It may be somewhat of a surprise if you've traveled through the central parts of the country where there are really no rivers that flow all year long, to find out that the northern borders and the southern border are defined, at least to some extent, by rivers. Now, I've talked about the river in the south in the past and how it relates to the dunes and how it relates to the creation of the dunes. But in this video, I'm going to talk about the rivers in the north. The rivers in the north are a region that's really special to me. I always have this feeling when I'm driving from the southern parts of Namibia or the central parts of Namibia up towards the north, that there's a real shift in the feel of the country. And this is to a large extent because of the history of the region. There is a vast fence cutting Namibia from east to west that we call the veterinary fence or the veterinary control fence. And this massive fence was set up in order to prevent livestock in the central and southern parts of Namibia from contracting diseases that are found throughout the rest of Africa. And what this has meant is that south of this veterinary fence, we have commercial cattle ranches, cattle farms, and north of the line, we have people living in communal areas, so people living in villages with their own livestock or their own gardens or that kind of thing. And so as you cross this veterinary fence, there's a real sense that you're in a different place. It's almost like traveling from one country to another. There's a very big feeling that it's different. And one big factor that contributes to this is as you get up towards the borders, there are these big rivers that, give a whole different type of life than what there is in the rest of Namibia. Namibia is arid in the east and hyper-arid, proper desert as you get to the west, as you get to the Atlantic coastline. So it's dry throughout. And the rivers that are found throughout the country are so ephemeral that they only flow a handful of hours a year most years. So it's really pretty incredible to drive up to the borders in the north and suddenly find these fairly large rivers, large by African standards. The rivers don't provide much opportunity for navigation, certainly not for big boats, but they're very useful for many other things. One of the reasons why Africa doesn't really have rivers to navigate is because the African plateau is so high. So very much of Africa, if you think of most major cities in Africa, Johannesburg, Nairobi, most of the cities that you think of in Africa are sitting at fairly high altitude, often above 1,000 meters, 1,400, 1,500 meters above sea level. What this means is that there's a fairly big cascading of rivers down towards the coastline. And so it means that very few African rivers are useful at all to boats. There are exceptions, but when we're talking about these rivers, navigation in a commercial sense is not an important thing for them. But they're super important in other ways. They're important to people, both people living in communal areas as well as modern life in the region. And then there's also the tourism factor. These rivers provide really fascinating areas to visit. I'm going to go over the rivers one by one and talk about the human factor and the wildlife factor related to these rivers. One thing that is really interesting about the three rivers that I'm specifically talking about today is the fact that they come from a very similar part of Africa, but they end up in totally different places, not only flowing in different directions, but also the setting of their final destination is uniquely different. The three rivers are the Kunene, which flows into the Atlantic in the west and still touching Namibia along its border when it floods out. And then there's The Zambezi River, flowing the other direction, it only forms the Namibian border for a very short part of its journey and then flows through, forming the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe until finally flowing through Mozambique and ending up in the Indian Ocean. So the two rivers, the Kunini and the Zambezi, flow totally the opposite direction into the totally opposite oceans on the two different sides of Africa. That, despite the fact that their catchment areas, the place where the rivers start, is fairly close together up in the highlands of Angola and the highlands of eastern Zambia. That's fairly unique. The Kunini River floods out in a very barren desert area, so deserty that there's dunes along part of its course towards the end, and unique countryside and dry country through which this river flows. The Zambezi, on the other hand, flows out into the Indian Ocean in a very lush area, because the Indian Ocean is warm along the Mozambique coast, so there's a lot of rainfall, and it floods out in this massive delta, creating a very big, lush, open delta area before it floods out. There's a river between these two, the Kavango or the Okavango River. Uniquely, this river does not reach an ocean at all. In fact, it floods out into a region that's pretty dry. The northern part of the Kalahari, you sort of think of the Kalahari as desert, but there's this region called the Okavango Delta, a massive area where this river floods out, and it's right in the middle of the continent, nowhere near an ocean. So it creates these big floodplains and vanishes into the desert sand. So that's the three rivers. They are really unique. Let's follow the Kunini River down and see what it does. The Kunini River flows from really the almost central to western part of Angola, flooding down, sort of coming down towards the Namibian coast. A few hundred kilometers before the Atlantic Ocean, it joins the border, and from there on westwards, the border between Namibia and Angola is made up by this river. Where it joins Namibia, we have the Ruacana Dam. This is a hydroelectric dam that's fairly important to Namibia's electrical power, especially up in that northern part of the country. Namibia has very little access to producing power for itself, and so that's very important. And then from there on, there's very little other commercial or large-scale commercial use of the river. There were plans to build an additional dam in the area, but fortunately that dam has not been built. I'm not sure if there's further plans to do so, but that river would cause devastation to local communities if it was ever built. So hopefully not. But the area is so unique because this is a part of Namibia where we find the Himba people and similar ethnic groups, and they are people who have still maintained a traditional lifestyle to a very large degree. The area is super remote, very few big roads or anything in the area. There's basically the roads are gravel roads or non-existent, just tracks in the desert. So very, very remote part of the country. It flows over some falls called the Ipupa Falls that are quite attractive, really unique spot, and really interesting to travel up there through the desert. If you're going through the northwest of Namibia, traveling through the dry, dusty Mopani woodlands, really on the verge of being, proper arid, and arriving at a river is with a big waterfall is just, there's something incredible about the experience of doing that kind of trip. And then from there, the river winds its way westwards, remaining the border between Namibia and Angola until it hits the Atlantic Ocean. That delta where the river floods into the ocean is a protected area. There's You have to have special permits to go to the area. I've never been. But these wetlands along the west coast are really important because of the lack of big rivers along the west coast of southern Africa. Every delta system that's there becomes very vital for migratory birds that work their way down the west coast of Africa. And so there's very active work done in the protection of these areas. And it's one of the reasons why they try to keep the area remaining closed, because many of the other similar areas like Walfish Bay ends up being a big commercial town. And so it's really important for migratory birds to have some of these refuges where there's relatively little contact with people. So that's the Kunini River, the one that ends in the Atlantic. Let's follow the Okavango River down. The Okavango River floods out from really the central part of Angola and flooding virtually straight down until it hits the border of Namibia. It forms the border for some distance. You have the big town of Rundu, an important place for people to cross the border between Namibia and Angola. And then it floods eastwards for some distance, and then takes a sharp turn, crosses that little narrow piece of land that's often called the Caprivi Strip, the beginning or just before the Caprivi Strip, and floods down into Botswana, and there creates the Okavango Delta. The beginning of the Okavango Delta is right along the border of Namibia. There's a tiny little national park, or it's a sub-region of the Bobota National Park, but Mahangu National Park is a really amazing place. And there's buffalo on the other side, two little nature reserves that form part of a bigger system of conservation areas. What's so unique about these tiny little reserves that are 12 kilometers across or so, the river enters as a river, and by the time it floods out, it's starting to spread into these swamplands, into these big channels. And then those channels break up as they travel southwards into Botswana, forming the Okavango Delta, which is this vast swampland. The Okavango Delta is one of the most unique places in Africa. It's incredible to see from the air, where you've just got this enormous area of channels of water and these little islands where there's reeds or little thickets of trees, or often just termite mounds surrounded by channels of water. It's a really important place for wildlife. There's incredible wildlife diversity there. You have all the normal stuff. There's a lot of crocodiles in the water. There's hippos, tons of hippos. There's huge populations of elephants moving through the area. There's buffalo. There's really good numbers of predators, including African wild dogs, so lions, cheetahs, leopards, all those things. And some unique things. There's some unique antelope that are pretty much only found in these swamplands, created by specifically these rivers that I'm talking about, like the Waterway. Another really important thing for anybody who loves birds, it's prime birding country. There's just incredible birding opportunities to be done. Some unique things like the Paul's fishing owl would be a special to the Okavango Delta for keen birders. But just seeing the birds in that region, just going out on boat rides there is magic. When you're on a boat ride in the reeds in the middle of the Okavango Delta, far from lodges, far from anything else, it feels unworldly. It feels like it just doesn't feel like you're anywhere that has anything to do with anywhere that you've been before. At least that's my experience. I love being there. I haven't had a lot of chances to be there, but I always find it incredible. It's just such a unique place. As far as hydroelectric power on the Okavango River, so far not much. There are always talks about that kind of thing, but hopefully that doesn't happen. Additional talks about taking water from the Okavango and using that for irrigation and for communities in Namibia. Taking water out of that river on a big scale would be devastating to the wildlife in Botswana, to what is a World Heritage Site, a really important wildlife area, and an area that not only supports nature, but supports a huge number of people as well. the amount of tourism into the Okavango Delta creates jobs for many, many people. It's all these things are always a catch-22 in the African context. Another thing that does happen is there's a huge and growing amount of irrigation along the rivers, and the Okavango is a big one. Things like sugar planted in areas that largely were woodland areas before. That has an impact on the region in many ways. That's the Okavango River. Really amazing river. Then the Zambezi. The Zambezi is one of the longest rivers in Africa and flows all the way from, it has tributaries in Angola and then also in Zambia. And they come together to form the Zambezi River. It only forms the border of Namibia for a short distance. It's a unique place where it does. There's another river that I haven't mentioned today, mainly because it just floods into that. It's the Kwando-Chobe system, and that river ends up flowing into the Zambezi, forming this point where Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia all meet on one point, a very unique thing for borders. And then the Zambezi flows on from there. It flows as the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia over the Victoria Falls, one of the most possibly the most spectacular waterfall in Africa, and then flows on and creates two very large dams. It forms the Kariba Dam and then the Koribasa Dam in Mozambique. And then just before it floods out, creating this very large delta area. It has many important wildlife areas along its route. Probably the most well-known would be the Chobe system, although that's the Chobe River, but it's very close to the Zambezi. There's an enormous amount of wildlife there, one of the most densely populated area for elephants, and incredible wildlife along that Chobe area where the rivers meet northeastern border of Botswana. The dams are incredibly important, but incredibly dangerous and worrisome. These massive dams suffer from maintenance issues, and because of the sheer scale, they're absolutely massive dams, and the number of people that depend on these river systems means that any catastrophic failure in these dams would be potentially a massive disaster, killing many people. So there's always a huge amount of concern around these dams. But on the other hand, they're vital to provide power not only to Zimbabwe, but even down to South Africa, which doesn't even touch these rivers. So very important, but concerning places that need important management.